So I had an appointment with Dr. Yoon today, and I wanted to share some awesome scans and some information I got, a little update on my treatment. So as you guys know, this is successful expansion, and it's not too much more than the last time that I showed you guys, but I actually started having an issue where the device started to really push on the molars, and I was getting a lot of pain. So I stopped turning, but the pain didn't go away. So what I ended up doing was I went and reversed the turn, and then it started to feel much better over the next day or two. And so I kind of wanted to keep turning and get some more expansion, but I didn't want to compromise my teeth and cause any bone loss or anything like that. So we took a look at the scans to see, do I need more expansion? How much did I get? Is this good enough? And so let's take a look at it. So here's an awesome photo, just a frontal photo where you can really see that suture broken apart and that gap in between, that sweet, sweet diastema. And here's a top-down view where you can see that small gap as well. Now, a lot of people have asked me, why was this MARPE more successful than the last MSE? And there are differences between the MARPE and the MSE, but one thing that Dr. Yoon told me is that she believes it's possible that the MSE could have helped and contributed. Perhaps this custom MARPE wouldn't have worked if I used it on the first try. It's hard to say. So other differences I mentioned were that it has 6 screws instead of 4, and it's placed more posteriorly, which allows it to have more bicortical engagement. And she did the aggressive corticotomy, which is where she basically just helped drill along the suture to help weaken it. And I wanted to show some of these cool pictures. So in this scan, you can see that the very back 2 screws are bicortically engaged, meaning that the screws have punctured into the nasal cavity. And then here's a scan of the other 2 screws, which are more anteriorly, more towards the front. And you can see that they're almost breaking through the nasal cavity, these non-angled ones. And then these 2 are also almost breaking into the sinus cavity. What she told me is that you don't want, while you do want bicortical engagement on these straight standing screws, these tilted screws, you don't want them to puncture into the sinus cavity because you'll have risk of infection. So she placed it just perfectly, so everything hopefully should stay healthy. All right, and this scan is a really interesting one. It's a scan of my skull before and after laid over each other. And so what you're seeing here is that the blue skull is my before, and it's kind of set behind, and the white skull is the after. So anywhere you see white is basically the change. And so you see exactly what you expect. A lot of people call this maxillary expansion, this procedure I'm getting, but a lot of people are starting to try calling it mid-face expansion, and this is exactly why. Again, remember, blue in this context means no change, pretty much. Everything above the eyes is blue. That means no change. Everything on the mandible is no change. The only time that the white is peeking through is on the entire mid-face. So the cheekbones have pushed outward a little bit, and the maxilla has pushed out a little bit. This isn't a perfect comparison because I maybe had my head in a little bit of a different orientation between the 2 photos. But one of the things she mentioned is you can see a little bit of white right here on the mandible. And what she told me is that that's often a product of the fact, and I didn't know this, that these maxillary expansion treatments actually cause some slight advancement as well, slightly brings the jaws forward. And I don't know how that works, but I find that interesting. I also don't know if it's significant enough to make a difference in your symptoms if you're a person like me who has low posterior airway space and they need advancement. And so she did some measurements, and here's what we were able to measure. So there are two measurements that matter, really. One is the intramolar width. It's the distance from the root of one molar to the root of the other. And there's different ways to do this measurement. So you might not exactly be able to compare my values with your values. But that's one measurement called intramolar width. And then the other one is the width of the nasal floor. Remember, the midface expansion and this whole maxillary expansion expands the entire midface out this way. So you'll get the most expansion at the teeth and the least expansion, up at the cheekbones, and something in between here on the nasal floor. So the width of the nasal floor before expansion was about 28 millimeters, and after that increased to 31.5 millimeters. So that means that the width of the nasal floor more or less is how much the suture had broken. So the suture really separated an amount of 3.5 millimeters. So that's how much my nasal floor expanded, which kind of gives you a better number about how much my nasal cavity expanded as well, and how much breathing benefits I got. And my intramolar width before expansion was about 59.3, and it increased to about 66.7. So I achieved 7 to 8 millimeters of intramolar width expansion. That means more tongue space for my tongue to rest on the roof of my mouth. And this was what she was looking for. She said she was looking for 5 to 6. She got 7 to 8. So that's a lot better. But I still have some problems with nasal breathing. I'm not too worried because there are other options that are going to help. One thing, I think that CPAP causes a lot of nasal congestion. I wonder if one day, if I don't need CPAP anymore, I might just have a lot of benefits that way. Another thing is that a lot of patients who get MMA actually report improvements in their nasal breathing. So when I get my MMA or double jaw surgery, that should help too. And then also, I had an appointment with my surgeon, Dr. Liu. We canceled Dome. It's officially not happening. And he said that in the future, we might want to look into nasal valve repair or similar types of minimally invasive procedures where they just put little rigid pieces into your nose to prevent it from collapsing. Basically, it simulates a nasal strip, but it's surgically inserted into your nose. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to end up needing that, but I did actually do less turns than what Dr. Yoon wanted because, like I said, I had pain on the molars. So one thing that she suggested we could do is this, and I thought it was a pretty interesting idea. I'm going to need to take the sleeves off and leave all the screws and everything else left in place so the bone can heal without compressing again. The question is, can I then still turn the device when the sleeves and the molars are cut off? That way it's not pushing against the molars so much? Well, the answer is usually no. Because without the stability of the sleeves on the molars, the device force might not be pushed in the way it wants, and the device might shift and turn and bend, and that will cause all sorts of issues. She said in my case, actually I should be able to do this for about another millimeter if I want more expansion. And I can reverse it if not. I mean, it's not a big deal. But I can do it because I have those side-facing screws, those tilted screws, and those help a lot with that whole torsion issue where the MSE might twist around. So there's actually less of a need for my molar bands than you would need in a traditional MSE. So even though I'll have Invisalign and everything, I might slowly try to get just a little bit more expansion. Another thing that she noted is, and I've mentioned this before, is that I have a very narrow mandible. So if my maxilla expands too much, then my mandible is not going to be able to meet that increased width. There are operations to expand the mandible, but they're generally considered across the board as unsafe. So should the maxilla and mandible ideally be the same size? Actually, no. Your maxilla ideally should actually be 5 millimeters wider than your mandible naturally. After this procedure, mine is now already at, I think she said either 7 or 8 millimeters wider. So it's already more than it ideally should be. But the problem is that my mandible is too narrow. So at least I'm fixing one of the two jaws. Anyway, adding another millimeter onto that, it's going to be significant, and she's going to have to really tilt my teeth down to have my bite match. So this video is getting a little bit long. I'm going to cut it here and continue in another video coming up.